Who wrote the Acts of the Apostles? And that is our video topic for the day. So, what are the Acts of the Apostles? Let's introduce the text. The Acts of the Apostles is the first instance of church history literature. And you can see a fragment from 250 AD pictured here with some Greek letters on it, as you can see. You have an epsilon here, a lambda, a P, I think, an iota, a delta, another iota. Looks like, LPD or something. I guess that's maybe the dative singular form of elpis, which is the word for hope, I think, but don't take my word for that. I didn't really look at it very carefully. But anyway, the Acts of the Apostles, you know it in the New Testament as the fifth book in the sequence. It comes after the canonical Gospels, and scholars tend to think that it was composed after the first wave of the Christian Gospels, the canonical Gospels, and it is usually dated to the late 1st or early 2nd centuries AD. So it portrays the church as united under the apostles, especially Peter and Paul, to proclaim the good news of Jesus to the Roman world. So the idea behind the text is to tell you what happened right after the life of Jesus. So the Gospels tell you about the life of Jesus, and then the Acts of the Apostles tells you about the life of the apostles after Jesus. It gives you the starting point of church history, and it's the first book of its kind. So now we're going to talk about who wrote this text, because it's a very interesting debate among scholars, and since I had to do a little assignment on this for school a semester or two ago, I thought I would go and turn that into a little video since I had run out of ideas for a while. But as you know from the last time we made, a little authorship video, there are a few different ways to look for information about who the author might be. And the first one would be internal evidence of authorship. So internal evidence would just be evidence from within the text itself. We have the Acts of the Apostles, and we look inside the text of the Acts of the Apostles to find out who the author might be. So the unfortunate thing is that the author does not say who he is. So the Acts of the Apostles is like the Gospels in this case. The author does not identify himself. So no one claims to be a specific person. That is, the narrator of the text does not claim to be a particular person. But there are two other ways in which the author includes some information that is about himself or might be about himself, or at least it's information that can be taken and judged relative to who the author might be. But the first piece of information is this: he names the person to whom he addresses the book. We don't see this in the other Gospels except for Luke, which was probably written by the same person as Acts, but we'll talk about that later. And then the second thing is that the narrator refers to himself in the first person during some portions of the book. And we can take this to be a reference to the author talking about himself, but we can only think about it that way if the author intends for the audience or the reader to equate the identities of the author and the narrator. In other words, you know that sometimes if you write a book and you write it in the voice of the first person, you might not be identifying yourself with the narrator. If you're writing a novel, for example, and the character in the novel is narrating the story, obviously the narrator is not the same thing as the author. But we would have to determine ahead of time what is the case for the Acts of the Apostles in order to talk about whether the narrator and the author are the same person and what that might say about the author. So let's look at some examples of this internal evidence of authorship. So the first verse of Acts in the first chapter is a good place to start. You can see here in the Greek text begins like this: ton men proton logon epoiesamen peri panton ho theophile hon erxato ha Jesus poien te kai didaskein. Okay, so in English, I would roughly translate this like in the following way: I made the first book about everything, O beloved of God, which began what Jesus both did and taught. And then he goes on and talks more about what Jesus did and taught and what the disciples did. Okay, so you can see here that the name of the fellow, Theophile, is referred to in the vocative case here, right? So it would be Theophilus in the nominative. The guy's name is beloved of God or beloved by God or a friend of God. It means something like that. So what is this person supposed to be? Is this supposed to be an actual name, or what is the idea here? So I looked in the Oxford Annotated Bible for some comments, and the famous scholar on Acts named Christopher Matthews says that there are two options for interpreting this name. It could be a literal patron of the author, maybe someone who paid for the publication of the book, or someone who is a friend of the author, someone whose name actually is Theophilus. Or the author could just be, this Theophilus person could be a symbolic image for any ideal reader. So, in other words, for the author of the Acts of the Apostles, the ideal reader would be someone who is dear to God. Someone who is a friend of God, who wants to do what God says and what God commands, has a relationship with God, and that sort of thing. So, what would this say about the author of the Acts of the Apostles? Well, it could indicate, if Theophilus is a patron, it could indicate that Luke is, a well-respected scholar or a scribe or something who works for this guy, and this guy commissions this writing to be a history of the church, and Luke sets about and writes out the history that was requested. Okay, but we don't know that for sure because it hinges on what this Theophilus reference means. So the second example, I just pulled one out of several from the second category. We see here that there are places in the Acts of the Apostles in which the narrator refers to himself in the first person. We just talked about this a little while ago, and we can see an example here from Acts 16:10, and the narrator says, "Hos deto horama Aden Eltheos edzetesamen exelthein heis Macedonian sumbibadzantes hoti proskekletai hemas hotheos evangelisasthai autus." Okay, so the way I would render this is, and since he saw the vision, we sought to go to Macedonia immediately, deciding that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. So you can see the key words here, we and us. The narrator is including himself in the group of people. So the context of this story is that Paul and some of his friends are going around evangelizing the Mediterranean world and trying to win them to the cause of Christ, win them to the church. And Paul sees a vision, he has a dream or something like that, and a man from Macedonia comes and begs Paul to come and preach the gospel to the Macedonians. And that's the vision that happens here. And that's why the author says, okay, since we saw the vision, we went to go to Macedonia immediately, because we understood that vision to Paul to mean that it was God's will to proclaim the gospel to the Macedonians. And so you can see the verbs of interest here, or the verb of interest here is edzetesamen, which means we sought, and then this noun, hemas, it means us. Okay, so this shows that the narrator is including himself in the story. But the real question here is he also supposed to be the author? So you can see some tremendous difficulties that come from using these types of evidence in the Acts of the Apostles to determine who the author is, because there are two different ways to interpret the evidence in each of these examples, and you have to decide which one you think is right before you can even begin to say what the implications are for the identity of the author. So it's very difficult. It's very complicated. So now let's go from the internal evidence to the external evidence of authorship. And this is also an interesting area, and this actually gives us a little bit more room to work with, but it has its own problems. And so we can see that the author does not identify himself in the text. But other early Christian authors did make claims about who this author was. And the best example here would be Bishop Irenaeus, who's very famous. If you study early Christian literature, his name comes up a lot because he's a big source of information. And he wrote a book called Against Heresies in the year 180 AD. And his claim there was that a physician, a medical doctor named Luke, was the author. And that's why, that's one of the major reasons we have the reference to the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. And the view of modern scholars today is that Luke and Acts were written together, possibly as a composite work that circulated as one, like a two-part thing, because in the Gospel of Luke, the book is dedicated to Theophilus, and then in the Acts of the Apostles, the book is also dedicated to Theophilus. So as you know, subsequent Christian traditions followed that trend, and today all the great communions of Christian, whether you're Catholic or Orthodox or Anglican or Low Church Protestant or something like that, you have this idea that Lucan authorship is probably right. But some churches are more dogmatic than others about it. And so now let's go to the modern scholarly discussion. You can see that these facts that we just went over present the following puzzle. The author wrote between 80 and 150 AD, and he doesn't tell us who he is. And Irenaeus wrote in 180 AD, and only then identified the author as Luke. So we have at least a 30-year gap, and possibly, and maybe even more likely, a 100-year gap between the composition of the Acts of the Apostles and the attribution of Acts to Luke by a Christian bishop. And so the earlier you think that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are, then the longer the gap is between the original writing and the attribution of the book to the evangelist Luke. So historians like Christopher R. Matthews, who's pictured over here on the right, they believe that it is impossible to know who the author is for certain. And if you're disappointed by that, then that's unfortunate. But if you've watched enough of my videos and read enough books and seen other people's videos, that is usually the answer we have to give for most ancient literature. Here I'm saying litter. Most ancient literature. It's very rare to know who wrote something in the ancient world. But Christopher Matthews, in his comments in the Oxford Annotated Bible, you can draw three conclusions from the Acts of the Apostles to think about who the author might have been. So we can tell that he was a very literate Greco-Roman Christian who knew how to imitate the style of ancient historiography. Was he probably a Jew? I don't know for sure, but I would imagine probably not, because he's much more concerned about the Greco-Roman audience, and it's not necessarily clear to me that he's really trying to engage the Jewish questions quite as much. But that's up for debate, and I'm not an expert on that particular topic. But this much we do know. He knew that he wanted to imitate the style of ancient historiography. He's trying to write a history of the church. And the second point is that he clearly admired Paul. He has all kinds of good things to say about Paul throughout the book. And so that leads some scholars like Matthews to think that maybe this author came from Asia Minor or another place that Paul evangelized. So he's probably from the Eastern Mediterranean or something like that. And then the most important point is that he wanted to present Paul and the 12 apostles as united rather than in conflict. A big thing for the author of the Acts of the Apostles is to show that the apostles didn't fight with each other, but rather they came to two decisions together in a conciliar fashion. They would get little councils together and make decisions together. So that's something that's very important to the author. So anyway, that's all we had to say about this particular piece of early Christian literature, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time for our next production.